The content of the Tandem Radio program and website is intended for general information purposes only. It's not designed to provide listeners with specific and personal financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or other advice. The views expressed by show hosts, their guests, and callers are their own and should not be construed in any way as opinions of Tandem Radio or the Bridge FM network.
Well, welcome back to Tandem Radio. This is your host, Glen. I'm just excited to be here this morning talking to you about the good news on business. And our subtitle for today's show is Faith and Elections. And speaking to me today is Jordan Rickards, who has an extensive background, as you heard in the first segment. Not only a committed Christian and a local attorney, but also worked in the prosecutor's office and has seen a lot of things relative to the family, but also has some good insights and has studied about our history and the history of our country. And what we're talking about today is, since the election is only a week or so away, to focus in on faith and elections and what does that really mean. I mean, to be a Christian and to vote is obviously important. I think it's one of our rights and privileges for this country, and we need to take it seriously, and hopefully you'll be getting out and voting when the time comes. But what does that really mean? Are we really looking at it from a Christian perspective, and does that play at all into politics for each one of us? I mean, a mentor of mine many years ago said, you know, the average person will say you can't talk business, politics, you can't mix business, politics, and religion. But if you're truly a Christian, you can't separate those things. Those things have to be blended in what you think and what you say, and should be a part of your character if you're truly committed to God. So keep that in mind, that it's so important to think about this from a Christian perspective. So Jordan, we know that obviously you ran on a Republican ticket. You're a committed Christian, and you have a good law background. Let's kind of test your history background a little bit. Let's go back to almost the beginning of this country, or I should say prior to the beginning of this country, for the Founding Fathers. Now, I know a lot of times the media would like us to think that Christianity has nothing to do with our country. The current president, unfortunately, came out publicly for the first time ever in the history of this country and said this is not a Christian nation, which was shocking to me, very disappointing, but that's a whole other thing. But I looked it up on Wikipedia a little bit, and what they say about our Founding Fathers, and I know Wikipedia is not a great source, but it's interesting because it does kind of, I think, give a little flavor of our society and what they're thinking. But what I found was that, according to Wikipedia, the religious affiliation and beliefs of the Founding Fathers were as follows. 55 delegates to the 1787 Constitutional Convention, 49 were Protestants and 2 were Roman Catholics. And among the Protestant delegates, the Constitutional Convention, 28 were Church of England or Episcopalian after the American Revolutionary War was won. 8 were Presbyterians, 7 were Congregationalists, 2 were Lutherans, 2 were Dutch Reformed, and 2 were Methodists. And I know God's not about labels, right, but all of these were church-going people. And if that wasn't enough, of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, nearly half held seminary Bible school degrees. With that in mind, how do people today think that our Founding Fathers were not committed Christians?
Well, people see what they want to see. Even those who will concede that the Founding Fathers were Christians will say to you, well, so what? That was 300 years ago. Let's talk about today. But it's undeniable, like you said. The data is very clear. And what they'll do is they'll throw out a few anomalies. They'll say, well, you know, Thomas Jefferson, sure, he read the Bible, but he read an edited version of the Bible that excluded all of the miracles.
The Jefferson Bible.
Sure. And Benjamin Franklin was, you know, he was a hedonist and an outright degenerate, which is true. You know, you had people like Aaron Burr who were, you know, philanderers, you know, our founder, and probably people like, you know, Alexander Hamilton were not the most committed Christians. I mean, he was a man who was entirely self-centered. But it cannot be denied that our Founding Fathers intended for their American experiment to be unique in that it was an experiment in self-governance. If you look at any other government that's really been created, the people who create it do so to empower themselves. Right. We create a government that was designed to empower the people. And what they recognized, and John Adams summarizes succinctly, was that our Constitution was designed, and could only be designed, for a moral and religious people, and it is wholly unsuitable for the governance of any other. Now you say something like that and people say, well, does that mean atheists have no place in America? Well, no, it doesn't mean that, so long as they are morally guided. And even the atheists who you know and who I know who are morally guided, whether or not they choose to acknowledge it, right, their morals are being informed by religiosity. Their morals are being informed by basically, you know, the Christian ethic of do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Because without that basis, You can't have self-governance. You need more centralized control, and you need more control over your lives.
Yeah, and it's funny because you mentioned empowering the people, and I think it's so important to bring that up so early, because what I think people don't realize today is bigger government takes the power away from the people. And it's such common sense to you and I as we sit here, but it's amazing how the average American, they see bigger government as some type of benefit to them in the respect of, obviously these special interest groups and all these programs and so forth that are out there. But how do people get that misconception? What makes them think that bigger government's going to help them keep their power as people?
Because people don't see the connection between the forfeiting of individual responsibilities and the forfeiting of individual rights. They don't recognize that the more you ask the government to do for you, the more the government will require from you.
Right.
And take, for example, this situation with nationalized health care. People want the government to pay more and more for their health care.
Right.
But the natural reaction of the government is to say, okay, if you want us to pay for this, now we're going to tell you what you're going to get, and now we're going to tell you what you're going to eat and how you're going to live your lives. You see this in New York, where the mayor of New York City has outlawed sugar-based beverages over, I think, 16 ounces.
Right.
Because he's saying, well, look, if government is going to bear the cost of your lifestyle choices, then government is going to inform the lifestyle choices you make. So our job, Glenn, has to be to inform people that the more you ask the government to do, the more the government is going to take from you.
Right. Well, it reminds me of two things. Number one, sounds good but doesn't work. So many of the ideas that these liberals put forth to us, they sound good. We want to take care of the poor, we want to do this, we want to do that. They sound good, but they don't work. And the other thing it reminds me of is a quote that one of my mentors taught me a long time ago. The government cannot give you anything they haven't first taken away. And so many people miss that point, and they want people to get, but they don't realize what they're giving away to get it.
Or we're gonna have to pay in the short future. I mean, right now we've been living very high off of cheap credit, basically.
Yeah.
We have $16 trillion in debt. If you combine our debt with our unfunded liabilities, it's about $61 trillion.
Wow.
And to put that in perspective for you and your audience, there's only $59 trillion in the entire world, and you can. I read that in USA Today. So if we levied 100% tax on every citizen in the whole world and took all of their assets, we wouldn't have enough money to pay our bills.
Wow.
I'm reminded of something Gerald Ford once said, and Gerald Ford was not known for his sagacity,
right,
as you know, but he hit the nail on the head. He said, a government large enough to give you everything you want is a government large enough to take from you everything that you have.
Right.
And that's basically what we're empowering the government to do to us.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Well, let's stay focused for a minute on these Founding Father concepts. I'm finding that, it's amazing how people in academia, especially, I think in the secular world, want to rub out this Christian connection to our founding documents and so forth. But I was shocked to find even this quote from an author and a history professor who is from the secular side, and Thomas L. Kidd. He was asked how did religion and politics intersect at the founding of the U.S. And even he said the early presidents set a pattern of routinely having proclamations of days of prayer and fasting. Early Congresses hired chaplains and put them on the payroll to lead sessions in prayer and so forth. Even Jefferson, who is known as a kind of far-reaching, strict separationalist, we view him that way today, would attend church services in government buildings. How do we go from having government buildings allowing church services to today being so far from that? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you'd see a lot of decay in the 60s. You have this the first post-World War II generation kind of coming into their own. You have, it's really a perfect storm of problems. You have Vietnam beginning to accelerate, and you have, I think, the church failing really to adopt and adapt to new realities. You had the rise of rock and roll music, for example, with Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis, and really a lot of Johnny Cash in the Deep South, and the church took the position that we don't want any of that. We don't want any of that in our buildings. And what was Elvis Presley singing about, for God's sake? I mean, blue suede shoes and hound dogs. Like, this is so scandalous. And I think that turned a lot of young people off, and it began to divide them from the church, from the community, and from their families. And what you see in the 60s is a complete rejection of what are seen as American values, of family and God and hard work even, because all these things, when you understand them, are intertwined, and an acceptance of this counterculture, which is defined only by the rejection of all of those other things. It has no unifying principle other than that we don't want to be like our parents.
Right.
And that combined with the rise of the welfare state and the sexual revolution, I don't think that can be denied, really led to the compromising of the family, and the more the family has been compromised, the more people have looked away from religion and away from the family, and they needed something else to provide a framework and to provide the same security that the family and religion had previously been providing, and they found that wrongly in government.
I think you made a great point there about how the church neglected to embrace people and ideas that could have been embraced. Again, they weren't vile per se or whatever, but by pushing them out and pushing them away and putting them out, as the scripture says, turning them over to Satan, literally allowed Satan to take control of all that. And what did they do? They end up with a media who they pushed away to start with, now is all of a sudden controlling things in a new way. And it's a media that's controlled literally in most cases by the liberals, and it's very, it just hit me just now when you said that, how we kind of pushed it off to Satan, and what did he do? He stepped up to the plate where we didn't.
Well, not just the media and Hollywood and academia.
Yep.
And what are those three things, I don't know how much time you have left in this segment, but what do those three things all have in common? What they all have in common, I'll get to this later, is that they're all run by people who don't do anything. An actor pretends to be someone else doing something. A journalist reports on what someone else is doing. Okay, an academic talks about what other people are doing. But since they're not doing the doing, they're not informed by real-world experiences.
I want you to repeat that when we come out of the break. We're going to pick up right there. You're listening to Tandem Radio here every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with our guest, Jordan Rickards, who's got a lot of good insights. And we're going to talk about the elections coming up and voting. And, of course, our theme for today is faith and elections, and how that should play a part in what you're doing and where you're voting, and where your right is to come in and step into a booth and make a difference, hopefully, this coming election. You're listening to us, the Good News on Business, every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be right back after this break.
One cut. Hi, my name is Cooper Ford from Tandem Radio, the Good News on Business. I want to thank you for joining us for this episode. Hopefully you've been getting some fantastic insights from Glen and our featured guest. While we're taking this break, I want to introduce you to our website at tandemradio.com, where there's a wealth of information focusing on bringing Christian principles into the business world. First of all, we have some of our other archive shows that are on there, where you can see some of our past guests and listen to their shows. Second, we also have Ask Tandem, which is our shorter video segments focusing on specific questions related to faith and the workplace. And finally, we have our sponsors, like-minded businesses and professionals who not only share our mission, but also who want to serve you. So check it all out at tandemradio.com. If you want to get in touch with us, you can also email us at info@tandemradio.com. That's info@tandemradio.com. And we look forward to hearing from you. So thanks again for joining us, and let's get back to Glenn and the show. God bless.
Well, welcome back to Tandem Radio. This is your host, Glen Dalakian, and talking today with attorney Jordan Rickards, who has quite a background in his legal profession, and also good knowledge in history of our country and where people are thinking and how they're voting. And he has run for office himself and found some unique insights. A thought came to mind to me, and I just have to throw it out there. The farther away in history we get, the more we think we know it all. It's amazing how we look back at our founding fathers, and I just want to wrap up this thought because I know we're going to come back to a thought that you ended with in the last segment. We look back at our Constitution, and it seems like when we look back at all that was put into that, these were people who were gave life and limb, under the threat of life and limb, to write a document that literally signed their own death warrant. And yet we look back at that, and we the liberals today seem to scoff at that and take our country in directions that I don't even think the founding fathers would recognize. Would you agree with that the farther away we get, the less we feel the importance of that document, or those documents? Yeah,
and I would say that's one of the main reasons we had to have a written document. Keep in mind that, British constitutional law, they do not have a constitution like we do. What they consider constitutional law is this aggregation of other sources like Magna Carta and so on and so forth. But our founders gave us a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution, and they were very explicit about what they were doing. They said, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And they did this both because I think they were remarkably prescient, but keep in mind also the historical context. Across the sea, you have the French Revolution, which is quite something different, which is, you know, bloody, and it's really secularized in nature, and they tried to create their own religion when you really study it. And our founding fathers said, no, that's not going to be us, that we're going to be a moral and religious people, and we're going to be grounded in an understanding and appreciation of God's values and His will for our destiny.
You know, it's amazing you mention that, because even in retrospect, you think about it, we wanted to have nothing to do with what was going on in Europe, right? I mean, we wanted to break away from that. We wanted to get out of tyranny. We looked at France. We looked at Spain and some of the crazy things those guys were doing over there, just back at the founding, right? And we said, we don't want that, right? But today, what's the current administration looking at? They're looking at, how do we be more like Europe? I mean, I think personally the EU is a total mess. I mean, here you got a governing body that says you can't use the word God in any of our documents. That's what they started with. Right there, they took God out of the entire equation. To me, that's a plan to fail, undoubtedly, but yet our current administration wants to be just like them, you know? And we could easily go off on a tangent on that, but what's your thought on that real quick?
Well, look what's happened in the EU. In the EU, you've seen increased secularization. You've seen the church reduce its influence and its authority. At the same time, you've seen the state expand. It's basically a zero-sum game. People are looking for the state to do more and more. And it's no coincidence that they are becoming increasingly morally bankrupt, if I might so opine, and fiscally bankrupt, because they've abrogated the whole concept of personal responsibility, and they're asking someone else to do everything else for them. And it's no coincidence that their currency is worth less and less, and their coffers have less and less, and their debts are higher and higher and can't be paid. I know it's quite a nexus to go from reduction in church to you're going bankrupt, but and it's a short segment, but if you understand it in context, you can see the connections.
Yeah, it's amazing what's happening over there, and like I said, the significance of it is our current administration wants to go in that same direction, which is just shocking. Well, let's go back to that the 3 points you made right before we ended the last segment. Why don't you repeat that for us?
Well, what I was saying is one of the things that really distinguishes liberals from conservatives is the idea of pragmatism. A conservative by his nature is a pragmatist. Liberals say, why not? Well, we actually answer that question. Well, because humans are fallible, because things cost money, because we've tried this and it fails. And what I was saying was that liberals as a whole, they tend not to have their opinions informed by real-world experience. That's why you see so many of them in Hollywood, where all you're doing is pretending to be someone else. A journalist reports on what someone else is doing. An academic writes on what someone else has done and talks about what other people should be doing. But none of these people are actually in the arena. None of them are doing the doing. So their opinions aren't informed by real-world experience. It's very easy for a liberal to say, well, why can't everyone have a job? Well, conservatives know that there are economic realities that maximize the amount of jobs and minimize the amount of jobs. And we are subject to those realities. So that's what really distinguishes us.
Yeah, it's amazing because you often hear liberals say terms like get real, and I never looked at it that way. They really often live in this sense of reality, and unfortunately, they seem to dominate this Democratic Party to an extent where they swung so far outside of reality that how do we bring them back in? I mean, not that that's another topic we could talk about another day, but I'm glad you made that distinction, because that seems to be one of the pivotal, or I should say rudimentary reasons why these parties are split so far apart.
Well, I think the greatest split is in the leadership of the parties. I think the Democrat leadership has gone off of the deep end. But if you look at really the typical Democrat who you meet on the street, they still believe the same things that most people believe. They want to keep as much of their paycheck as possible. They don't have a problem with some kids saying the word Jesus in a graduation speech. They pretty much believe in school choice. They believe in criminals should actually serve their sentences and not be released early. I mean, if you go down the list of things that defines conservatism, you won't find too much objection from the typical Democrat. What the Democrat Party has done well is they've convinced those people that we don't care about them. So their projection of us has become what they consider us to be. In other words, we don't care about the poor, we don't care about minorities, things like that. That's what our problem is.
And it's funny because when you look at it, it's Christians that founded the first universities, it's Christians that founded the first hospitals, it's Christians that have done so many of these things, but yet they're looked at, like you're saying, as don't care for the poor. Now, how much I mean, it's a two-way street. How much responsibility do we as conservatives have to take for that image?
Almost all of it, because it's our responsibility to form the image of ourselves for ourselves. We need leaders who are going to say, you know what, I'm not a Republican because I hate the poor. I'm a Republican because I care about the poor. Okay? It doesn't help the poor when you have energy policies that double the cost of energy, or that have gas policies that double the cost of gas, or where you have high inflation so that not only are people making less money, but the money they're making doesn't go as far. It doesn't help the poor when you have joblessness. It doesn't help the poor when you limit school choice, so all these poor minority children are trapped in these failing public schools. It doesn't help the poor when you don't place enough emphasis on law enforcement and actually putting bad people in jail, so you have more criminals infesting these poor neighborhoods. We're the party that cares about the poor. We're the party that has the answers to solve these problems, and it's time we start communicating that to them.
So in essence, I think we're dropping the ball, then you're saying, and where it comes in the Bible, it says, be salt and light.
I don't think there can be any serious question that we're dropping the ball when it comes to the poor, and when it comes especially to our minority communities. There was a poll out in the Wall Street Journal recently. It showed 96% of African Americans support Barack Obama, 0% for Romney, 4 undecided.
Right.
They said that was the first time in all of history they had a 0% for any major group. And that's our fault,
Right.
because we support many of the same things that they support. They want school choice, so do we. They want jobs. We have the economic plans that create jobs. And it's not more government, it's more private sector solutions, okay? They want lower priced gas. We're the party that says, let's build the Keystone Pipeline. Let's let these oil companies drill more. We'll reduce the cost of your gas. They're the ones that look, they want stronger families. We're the ones who place a higher emphasis on the family. The Democrats think that the foundation of any society is government. We understand the foundation of any society is the family, what happens in the household. We need to explain to people we are not the enemies of the poor. We are here to help you. We're here to lift you up. We're here to take you from being poor to being independent. The Democrats want to keep you dependent so that you're always dependent on them.
Right, right. So feed a man a fish as opposed to teach a man to fish. We
Precisely.
need to get that message across, that we really need to teach somebody to fish so that they can fend for themselves and do the things that they need to do. Now, as far as empowering the people, I mean, obviously, how do we give back more to the people from a power standpoint? I mean, unfortunately, we've really, I think, almost turned the corner where we're, become a dependency society here. I still think there's still more people that aren't dependent than are, but we're coming close to that if we haven't turned that corner already. So how do we help these people not be so dependent?
Well, I think you have to recognize two things. That as a Christian, we have an obligation to care for the poor. Now, the Republican message should be this: we are not opposed to welfare, so long as it's welfare as a safety net. What we are opposed to is welfare as a lifestyle. It does not benefit the poor to keep them always poor.
Right.
The problem you have is that when people who are poor and on welfare are trying to get out of welfare, the government punishes them by taking away their benefits. I'll give you an example real quick. A friend of mine's on unemployment. $600 a week she gets. She went and found a job that would pay her $150 a week part-time. Well, the government says, great, now we're going to reduce your benefits by $150 a week. So what's the incentive to work? If you're on food stamps, if you start working, you're going to get your food stamps reduced. You're going to get your Section 8 benefits reduced. So we have to create a welfare system like the one Milton Friedman thought of years ago. He had the idea of a guaranteed minimum income. You take all these programs, 106 federal welfare programs, combine them just into a guaranteed minimum income, which we give to people and we treat it as regular income, but when they start working, you don't take that away from them. Okay, so they have an incentive to improve themselves. Thomas Sowell said it best: right now we are paying people to fail and we are punishing them to the extent that they succeed. That can only lead to a lack of success and more failure.
Amazing. Well, we're going to talk more in the next segment about specifically, what the Bible has to say about these things and how we should be treating people. I mean, it's easy to just throw out there that, we have to be for the poor. And God makes that very clear, that He talks about widows and poor, and how we have a responsibility to take care of them. And as you say, Jordan, I think the Republican Party's done a very poor job of making that clear to people. And on the reverse side, I think the other side has done a real good job of creating a wedge between us and the people. And, of course, taking that wedge and filling it with government and that bigger government concept that just cannot work well for business, at least I think, and we need to be watchful of that. So you listen to Tandem Radio. We got a lot more coming up. We're around 2/3 through our show today, and one more segment, but a lot of powerful information here today. So stay tuned. More and more info available to you at tandemradio.com. Tandemradio.com is just a resource where if you're in business, you're going to want to go there and see what's there, because there's archived shows on a variety of topics, of things you may even be having a challenge with. There's contacts there. There'll be a link to Jordan there if you want to correspond with him, and so much more. Info at tandemradio.com. Drop us a line. We'll be back after this. Well, welcome back to Tandem Radio. We're pretty fired up in the studio here today. It's an exciting time. Election's right around the corner, and so much is at stake. And I hope if you're listening here, you're realizing that we just want you to think. We want you to think clearly. We want you to think with your faith hat on if you need to, if you're not already doing that, and realize that your Christian background, your beliefs, should have an impact on how you vote when you get in that booth. It's so important. And I know it's hard because you're bending the pressure and there's society saying one thing, and the world's always going to tell us different things that don't align with our God's will. And we need to be salt and light. We need to stand out and make that difference. Let me just read our scriptures. Back to our guest, Jordan Rickards, who's an attorney and was kind enough to come in today and speak with us. Joshua 5:13-14. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but a commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." But as a commander of the army of the Lord I have now come. You know, I heard a preaching on this, and it was very interesting, and my own pastor talked to me about this scripture, and I find it very interesting, and I think something we have to remember. You know, it's easy for us to succumb to the world and say, hey, I'm Republican, we're the party of God. Hey, I'm Democrat, no, we're the party of God. Hey, everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but many people who go to war, both sides are saying, I got God on my side. But it's very clear that God's on God's side. You know, He's on neither side. He's on His side. And I think the sooner we as Americans get on God's side, the sooner we'll heal our land. And I want to close with a scripture on that. But it's amazing when you think about this. And I know I've read over this and never gave it a thought relative to our nation and our political scenario. But when you think about it, neither, he replied, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Amazing. 1 Peter 2:13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. You know, moral leaders we have to back up. We have to be there to support them. We have to make sure they get our vote, for sure. And we really need to think about that in this next election. Is the current administration going to take us where we need to be? Or is it going to take us to a place that would be even farther from what God had in mind for this great nation? So, with that said, Jordan, let's dig back into some of the things we were talking about and get right back to voting. And, you know, everybody gets to go in that booth, and it's private, and they close behind them, and no one knows what they do in there. But you know what? God's watching each one of us as we pull that lever. And I think if more of us had that in mind, we might even pull that lever differently. So let's talk about what aligns with Christianity. You know, from an individual standpoint, when people are reading their scripture, how do they differentiate? Why would they side with one party over another?
Well, usually when that question is asked, we go to the obvious answers, and the most obvious one would be pro-life, the abortion issue, which is a very sensitive issue, of course. But there can be no serious doubt, either from a scientific perspective mm-hmm. or from a Christian perspective, that life does begin at conception. Right. And even the most cynical people, who will say, who are the strongest proponents of abortion, and who say things that are utterly ridiculous, like, well, the relationship between a woman and a fetus at that stage is no different between a host and a parasite relationship. Right. Well, fine, but a host and a parasite are still two distinct organisms, aren't they? And you can't say that that's not a life. What the message from Christians needs to be is not that we are pro-life because we want to take away a woman's right to choose. We believe so strongly in a woman's right to her body that we understand that that right must begin when her body begins. Right. And the body clearly begins at conception. And even though I don't want to sound partisan on this, there is clearly one party that stands for abortion rights, and there is one party that, at least nominally, stands for the right to life, and that will appoint justices to the Supreme Court that will at least eat away, if not outright overturn, Roe versus Wade. Right now, our abortion laws are controlled by the Supreme Court, by 9 unelected lawyers, basically.
Right.
And if
That's a scary thought, right?
It is scary, and right now the vote is probably 5-4 to uphold it. The next president will probably appoint 2 new Supreme Court justices.
Right.
Okay, and think about what that's going to do for human rights. So this is not an insignificant election. It's the most significant election that I've seen in my lifetime, at least from a strictly social issues standpoint. And we can talk about the economic implications too.
And I think that's important. Let's go there. I mean, it appears to me very clearly that the current economic lack of planning, I should say, because I don't even want to call it planning, is putting us in a direction that's going totally wrong. I mean, I just speaking from my own business background, I've been in business many years, it does not make sense. So with that in mind, is there a moral reason why people should realize that, you know, less jobs are not good?
Well, there's a self-interest reason, for goodness sake. I mean, you asked during your introduction to this segment, you know, what are the next 4 years going to look like? Well, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is when Christ says, "You'll know a tree by the fruit it bears." The next 4 years are going to look like this 4 years, okay, with increasing debt and increasing joblessness. You know, a nation is only as strong as its money supply. Right. I think it was King Solomon in probably Ecclesiastes, might have been Proverbs, where he said, you know, feast maketh to marry, and wine maketh to laugh, but money answereth all things.
Right.
Well, think about how the next 4 years are going to be when our money is increasingly inflated. Look, there are only 2 ways we're going to deal with this debt, and neither of them are good answers right now if we don't reduce spending.
Right.
Number one is our wealth is going to be inflated away. The government will print more money to pay its bills, which means our wealth will be transferred away from us to our creditors.
Right.
Option number 2 is we simply decide we're going to default on our debts. We're just not going to pay them.
Right.
And that's going to lead to a global financial meltdown. Right. And then you won't have food on the shelves. So if you think the next 4 years aren't important, no, they are, because we have a closing window of opportunity to fix this problem. And I'm a man of faith, but sometimes I wonder whether that window is already closed or not, and whether we have the willpower to open it up and do what's necessary to save this country.
Let's not spend a lot on this, but let me go off on a slight tangent. Why should Americans who are Bible-believing Americans care about what goes on outside this country? Why should foreign policy be important to us?
Well, because our domestic policy, for better or worse, is a lot of times informed by foreign policy and the things that happen overseas. We don't have the willpower, for example, to drill our own oil, or at least not enough to provide for ourselves. In the 70s, we provided for 70% of our own oil. Today we get about 30%. So what happens in the Middle East affects us directly. And it's not just the price of gas being increased or decreased in nickel. That's our ability to get to work. It's our ability to heat our homes. It's our ability to put fuel in our helicopters and our tanks for our military. Okay, so energy independence from these foreign countries matters incredibly to the most industrialized nation in the world, which is what we are.
Right. And quite honestly, going back to the poor issue, how do we help others when we can't even help ourselves, right?
Well, precisely that.
It's amazing to see, I mean, this latest fiasco about borrowing money from China to give it away to undesirables in a foreign land. It's just incredible. So, we're down to our last segment. Any last thoughts you have in mind that, you know, about this voting issue? And you know, obviously people have to, I think, read their scriptures and understand. And I have a scripture I'd like to close with that I think relates very well to what we're talking about today. How about you, Jordan? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I would just end with this. My mother, you know, has a great saying. She says, it's not enough to vote. You got to vote, and you got to bring 3 or 4 people with you also to vote, because one vote only counts for one, but you have to multiply that, and you have to encourage those people to bring 3 or 4 people with them, and then you'll see the change, and then you'll see America start to get back on the right track.
That's a great point. Again, we have a little bit of time left. The elections are a week away. We need to get out there and make a difference and let people know, number one, why we're voting the way we are, and help them understand that they need to get out and vote, because a lot of people are going to sit on their hands this time. And if they make that mistake, they will regret it. I just want to end with this scripture because it came on my heart, and I think it's so important. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. That's 2 Chronicles 7:14. Maybe you need to meditate on that a little bit before you go to the election, to the polls. Thanks for listening today. I know we're a little passionate about what we're talking about, but we're fired up about it. Stay tuned. Be here every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time at Tandem Radio, or check us out at tandemradio.com, tandemradio.com. Thanks, Jordan, for being here today.
My
I
pleasure.
appreciate it.
My
God
pleasure.
bless you. And thanks to team and all. So we'll see you next Saturday right here at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time at the Bridge FM radio station, or at tandemradio.com, or on Facebook at Tandem Radio.